I would like to introduce to you Stephanie Weaver of Pingora Consulting, and we're really excited to have her today. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. Welcome to everybody on the line today. We are going to work through some potential pitfalls in the IEP process today. Please, as Susan said, feel free to ask questions, post questions. Let's get questions answered in real time as we're going through particular topics. I am Stephanie Weaver. I am a partner in Pingora Consulting, formerly an administrator with the Department of Education, and now have the privilege to be able to consult and work with states, school districts, and advocacy organizations across the country as a technical assistance specialist, as well as a complaint investigator and mediator. Today, we're going to tackle some topics that the department had identified as potential areas where the field needed clarification or there were potential pitfalls with the IEP process. So the topics for today are child find, evaluation and eligibility, links between special education and general education, a little bit about accommodations, and then finally that monitoring progress and ensuring that those FAPE links are made. So let's start with child find. We're going to talk about obligations. We're going to talk about some of the triggers or red flags for child find, being cautious about the role that interventions play in the child find process, considerations, and then up to referral, leading us right up to evaluation. We have to think about child find as a journey, and that it starts with a suspicion. And the suspicion piece comes directly from the regulations. So at 300-111, it talks about that child find has to include children who are suspected of being a child with a disability. And suspicion is that feeling, impression, a belief, and an idea. It isn't that it's certain. So certainty is not the standard under the IDA. It's if you suspect that this is a student who would meet the criteria and is in need of specialized instruction or special education and related services. And when that happens, you have a mature child find obligation. You can't delay at that point. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you know those things? How would you know, or what would cause you to have a suspicion? One of the first things that we have to remember is that child find, the duty is an affirmative duty. That means that it requires some sort of action. The district is in the position to have a process where they seek out or they can identify whether or not they suspect that this is a student with a disability. A pitfall to avoid or a danger is waiting for a parent to ask for an evaluation. So that affirmative one means that it's the school district's responsibility to have a process and take action. Another piece of child find that's important to remember is that children don't have to fail or be retained in a particular grade in order for there to be a suspicion that it might be a student with a disability. It's educational, so it could be that the student is getting good grades, but there are other areas of their educational environment or experience that you suspect that this might be a student with a disability. It also, depending upon, what your process is, grades are only a single piece of information that you might be considering as part of that child find process. The bottom line is just to know that failure is not required in order for there to be a suspicion. It's really a two-pronged test. And that test is that you suspect that there's an IDA disability and you suspect a need for special education. And when that happens, when those two things are suspected, you have a mature child find obligation. And at this point, it's important to remember that that's where the procedural safeguards attach. They attach at a mature child find obligation. So what are some potential triggers? We talked about that grades could potentially be a trigger. Poor grades could be, although it's not required. It may be that you have a student who is incidentally benefiting from some sort of specialized instruction that's already occurring in a classroom or as part of an intervention group. That might be for a student who continues to participate incidentally in that instruction for a long period of time and the gap is not closing. That might be a trigger, a child find trigger. Another one might be if you have a student that receives a new diagnosis of a condition that might raise some sort of suspicion about an IDA disability. Understanding that a diagnosis doesn't mean IDA disability or IDA eligibility, but we're talking about right now what might be some of those triggers or some of those things that would cause you to suspect that this is a student with a disability. Regular education student needs more and more intensive individualized instruction or other supports in order to be able to participate and benefit from instruction. That might be a trigger. And finally, the obvious trigger is if the parent requests an evaluation. The point about this is that your child find process, you need to cast a broad net and you need to have a system that policies, procedures, it creates a framework, including training staff on what your child find obligations are. One of those ways that you might create your system or an activity that might be in your system is screening. Screening actually does appear in the regulations and it doesn't appear in the way that we might use it for child find, but it does say that screening of a student by a teacher or specialist, it doesn't serve as the evaluation, but it might be one of those pieces that leads you to suspect that it's a student with a disability. So screening in that purpose, it might be large scale screening activities, it might be screening probes, it might be brief or periodic mini assessments that you conduct universally for all students. All of those activities would be part of your child find process or child find system. Another piece where you might gather some of that trigger data that we talked about, where you might suspect that the student has a disability, is through interventions. The caution, the pitfall here in the interventions is that you have to have a sensitive enough system, a tiered system that you know that you've crossed that threshold between a student who's responding to an intervention and a student who maybe isn't responding. And do you suspect, are there other triggers that are causing you to think that this might be a student with a disability? The pitfall is ignoring or delaying an evaluation on the basis that the student is somewhere in the intervention process and having policies that prohibit the evaluation of a student while they're in those processes. That can sometimes get teams or schools into trouble. The regulations, one of those ways, the regulations allow parents to ask for an evaluation at any time. And this comes from from the memorandum to state special education directors. The use of an RTI strategy can't be used to delay or deny the provision of a full and individual evaluation of a child that you suspect has a disability. We're going to talk a little bit about, you do have automatic, a parent's request doesn't mean automatic evaluation. There are pieces where if the school district has documentation, information, data that doesn't cause them to suspect that this is a student with a disability, there is a process for that. And we're going to talk about that. So kind of sticking with this intervention idea, consider this situation. This is a district that this is a case where the district found itself in an area where they were violating their child find duty because they were repeatedly referring students to interventions rather than evaluating the students for special education and related services. So this is another way that districts have to be cautious about delaying or denying a student evaluation. So that the district maintained it provided interventions and that those interventions had been developed by the student teacher team or this data team. And some of those interventions included Section 504 accommodations and additional tutoring. So the district kind of took this perspective that we were doing things. So therefore, there was no need to evaluate. The problem is that the interventions didn't demonstrate any positive academic benefits. So they were struggling to be able to demonstrate that the student was closing the gap or making progress. And this particular student continued to also struggle in the classroom in reading and math and science. And in fact, another piece of information that should have been considered was this student also had failed the statewide test for 3 years in a row. So you can see that there was this information that the district should have suspected that this was a student with a disability. It wasn't a single piece of information. It was actually a pretty robust amount of information and data that should have caused the district to say, this has met some of our triggers. We need to follow our child find process. Let's go through another example. This example was that a student who had been eligible and had received services in preschool, and he was exited from special education after preschool. The student continued over this whole time, had some behavioral and academic difficulties, and the student was screened for ADHD at the request of the parents. In 4th grade, the student was receiving interventions, and the school reported that there had been some progress, both academic and behavior. The student had demonstrated that. The student was receiving A, B's, and C's on his report card and had also met expectations on statewide tests. So you can see the district went through in very much the same way, opposite way of what was discovered in the other case. They were looking at grades. They looked at how the student was doing on statewide tests. And then in 5th grade, so that was in 4th grade. In 5th grade, the 5th grade teacher had concerns about his progress. The student's team was convened in October. A child study team was convened in October and in December. Interventions plans, they were developed and then they were revised. And in the spring, the parents obtained an independent evaluation due to continued concerns. At that point, the school convened a meeting as a result of the evaluation. Parents provided the information to the school, and they determined the student eligible under the IDA and created an IEP for the student's 6th grade year. So kind of a similar situation in that they were using their intervention process. And so the court ruled in this way. They said, although the student had some difficulties in the classroom, the evidence, the data, the information that the district had collected showed that he responded well to interventions. They were able to demonstrate progress, and that the student wasn't just advancing from grade to grade, but he was making actual progress within the curriculum. And so in this case, there was no child find violation, even though this process, even though these concerns, even though these parents had talked about it over a long period of time. The difference in this case, as opposed to the first case, was that the student was responding to the interventions initially, and at the point that the district got more information through the independent evaluation provided by the parent, that was enough for them to suspect that this was a student with a disability. But in this case, no child find, because they had followed their process. So what happens when a parent requests an evaluation? And what happens in the child find process when the parent requests an evaluation? Well, districts have really two choices. If the district agrees that the evaluation is necessary, like in the case of those triggers, the district may have academic information, may have behavior information, the parent may be concerned, the teacher may be concerned, the student has screening information, the student hasn't been successful on state or district-wide assessment. If the district agrees, then they would begin to promptly plan and propose a comprehensive evaluation, seek consent, and then move to conducting an evaluation. But if the school district doesn't suspect an IDEA disability and has the information necessary to explain why they don't share that suspicion, the district still has to issue prior written notice, documenting the reason for the refusal. The parent can challenge the refusal, because remember where those procedural safeguards attached, those attached when you have a mature child find obligation, you have to act upon it. And in this case, you have a parent who has made a request for an evaluation. So at that point, you have a mature child find obligation and must act. So responding to those that request. However, the parent does have procedural safeguards when a school refuses. They can do that through dispute resolution. So what might be, again, like some of those triggers for a referral for evaluation? It may be that the child doesn't make adequate progress over an appropriate amount of time. There's no time limit. It doesn't say that the student needs to respond within 30 days, within 60 days, within a semester. There isn't any, golden kind of drop dead number of days, but in the questions and answers to the response to intervention that OSERS put out, it wouldn't be acceptable for the LEA to wait several months to conduct an evaluation if that suspicion has gone to the point that you have a mature child find obligation. The point here is to use your multi-tiered system of support, or your RTI system, whatever you might call it, to really use it as another opportunity to collect data, to run it through your child find system. The bottom line is it's just inconsistent to use your system, your multi-tiered system, to deny a student or to reject a referral for an initial evaluation. So what are the critical points of child find? These points are critical. It's an affirmative obligation, it's ongoing, and it exists for all students within your district's boundaries. The obligation does extend to private school students who might be attending a private school within your boundaries. So you need to ensure that you have activities you have information that goes to those private schools, you respond if a parent from a private school requests an evaluation, all of those pieces, the obligation extends within your district's jurisdictional boundaries. It also requires that individuals who may not be special education teachers, special education case managers, it requires some education, some discussion around building intervention teams or RTI experts within your district, that they understand where that threshold is and when it's been crossed and the district has obligations around child find. So pay attention. There's danger in ignoring the triggers for child find. There's danger in delaying a special education evaluation if your child find obligation has matured. And pay attention when a parent requests an evaluation, that the district has a responsibility as part of child find to respond, to take some action and act. Susan, are there any questions?
Not at this time. We're good. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to move on to evaluation and eligibility. Evaluation under the IDEA really serves two purposes. The obvious one is that it is around, do they meet the eligibility criteria? But the second and probably more important piece is ensuring that it's comprehensive and that it identifies the special education and related service that the student needs or requires as part of how that adversely impacts their education. So again, two pieces to evaluation. We're evaluating to determine whether or not the student is eligible, meets the IDEA eligibility criteria, but we're also looking at what is that adverse educational impact? What are the student's needs? The start of the evaluation really is that planning piece. And I would encourage a question kind of inquiry process in order to develop that evaluation. There's also a time frame in which that has to be accomplished. And in Wyoming, that's 60 days. But keep in mind that adverse educational impact, it's educational. And although the federal regulations don't define educational, we've come to understand that we know it means more than academic. It could be social, emotional, it can be communication, it can be, there are states out there that do actually define educational. Alaska defines it as performance at school. Georgia defines educational performance as academic, functional, and/or developmental. So just keeping in mind as we plan this evaluation that we're talking about what are the students' educational needs. The visual up on the screen can be used as part of that evaluation planning team, which should include the parents. The way that this would look is that you go around and as a team, as a group of individuals, you're saying, what do we need to know about this student? What data do we already have about this student? And so you're kind of working around the outside of the wheel right now. What are the concerns? And you're looking at it at the child holistically. So you may not need to conduct an evaluation in each of these areas, but you need, as a team, the team must have a conversation about whether or not there are concerns in these areas, and do we have the data, the information to answer our questions. And it's in those areas where you can't answer the questions that you need to consider what data do you need to collect, what evaluation would be helpful in answering those questions.
Okay, Stephanie, we have a question. The question is, if during a screening, a child is flagged with a possible vision issue or is needing a visit to an eye doctor, can the school delay an evaluation until the parent takes the child for the appointment?
So there's a, if as a result of that vision screening, think back to those probes and those triggers we talked about, child find. If that piece of information, maybe there's additional information reported by the teacher, or there's been concern expressed by the parent around, student can't see the board, or students complaining of this or that. At that point, it wouldn't be okay to say, we don't suspect yet that this is a student with a disability, unless this is like a single piece of information that the district's getting for the first time and the student didn't pass the vision screening. And standard for all students is that parents follow up with a vision, a visit to the optometrist or whatever. If you had no other suspicions that this was just a routine screening and that came up and parents followed up just like any parent would, that's one thing. But if this screening is kind of compounded by these other concerns that you already had about this student, it wouldn't be okay for the district to put the onus on the parent to go and seek that evaluative information. At that point, your child find obligation has matured, and any type of data or information that the district needs in order to be able to determine whether the student's eligible and their needs would be the responsibility of the school district to obtain.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So once that information, once the team has had the opportunity to kind of use this probing question model or have a conversation about concerns that they have about the student, then the team needs to request consent for evaluation. I want to emphasize the importance of kind of using the team to develop that comprehensive evaluation. You need to explain then to the parent, these were the concerns, these are the evaluations we're going to be conducting, and we need you to consent to those. So it's kind of, the parent is involved in those processes. It isn't a solo person that gets the referral for special education and oh, this is a student that we suspect has a learning disability, check, check, check. These are the assessments we're going to do. The planning of the evaluation needs to be based on the individual student, because remember, the second piece of that evaluation is really determining what would be the needs that need to be addressed in the IEP. So that evaluation planning needs to be individualized. Once the parent has been fully informed, and in this case, it's through prior written notice and seeking consent from the parent for evaluation. What are some of those evaluation components? If when conducting evaluations, it's important to remember that you don't use any single, just one measure. You evaluate in all areas of suspected disability. So it's comprehensive. If you're going around that evaluation wheel and you have questions about a particular area, then it is the district's responsibility to plan and conduct that evaluation. That you're using technically sound instruments. So instruments are being used for the purpose in which they were intended, and that the tools that you're using are going to provide information to assist in determining educational need. So kind of that different not just that you're seeking information to be able to maybe meet the criteria or get a particular score, but remember that that assessment tool also needs to provide, what are the needs, what are the educational needs of that student. Once the evaluation has been conducted, it results in a report. So summarizing all of those particular pieces together, where is that convergence of information? Parents need to be provided a copy of the evaluation report and the documentation of determining eligibility. This is the way that parents meaningfully participate in an IEP meeting, is if they have the same information that others on the IEP team have. So at some point, that parent needs that information either at an eligibility determination meeting, or potentially it can be provided prior to the eligibility determination meeting. All of those different pieces, that parent needs to have that information in order to be able to participate. And just a side note, parent participation is one of the most important procedural safeguards in that lengthy document. And it is often one of the most highly litigated pieces, is that a parent is unable to participate in the process. Therefore, it's also one of the pieces that can rise to a denial of faith. So ensuring that there's some information in there and that the parent has it in a way that they're able to participate in the meeting. It also is it's a really good way to ensure that the team is working collectively. It builds trust, all of those pieces that are so important for having highly operational IEP teams. So how is that evaluation connected to the IEP? Well, it's connected through the present levels. So think about every IEP has to contain a statement of the present levels of academic achievement and the functional performance. So this is our first little connection to the general education curriculum, that conversation of how the disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. Well, that's the adverse educational impact, right? I mean, that's the measure that you were looking for in the evaluation. So I think if you keep that link to the IEP through the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance at the forefront of your mind when you're planning, when you're conducting evaluation, when you're determining eligibility, you've already made that really strong link between evaluation and present level when you connect those through evaluation. How does the court interpret that? There are a couple of really interesting cases around present levels and the importance of present levels in that evaluation. So this was a 2014 case, and in this matter, the court said that the lack of comprehensive evaluation, really getting at the student's educational needs, it resulted in that the IEP was inappropriate and that the present level was invalid. So you can see the importance of that evaluation wheel and making sure that you're conducting a comprehensive evaluation, because that's the connection, that's that piece to that educational impact in the general education curriculum. Also, thinking about present levels, that's where you describe the student's needs. It should be individualized and a reflection of the student's unique abilities. And again, that's compared to the general education curriculum. So a visual of what that might look like. If you think about up by the orange arrow, you start there, and in the present levels, these are the questions that you're going to be answering. What'd you learn? It could be from previous evaluations. It could be from standardized assessments, curriculum-based measures, all kinds of assessment information. And then in that present level, you're going to describe the student's current performance across those environments as compared to the general education curriculum. And you're going to describe how it affects their ability to participate and be involved in the general education curriculum. And from that, that's where you distill down to, so for this student, why can't they do those things? Those are the educational needs. And so that's the development of the present level. Here's a little bit of a heads up, kind of a caution about a pitfall. This was that a district denied the student FAPE when it failed to timely conduct, in this case, it was an autism assessment. This was, student had escalating behaviors, had an emotional disturbance, ADHD, and the student's IEP team met in December. At the meeting, the student's therapist, so keep in mind, this is in December, the student's therapist reported that she had completed an assessment and the student appeared to meet the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So this was a student that had previously been eligible, but it had been brought to the district's attention in December that the therapist had concerns about additional needs that the student had. The district went forth, proposed an evaluation, conducted the evaluation in 2017, but the court found that the student had, or that the district had sufficient notice of the student's disability prior, clear back in December. So the waiting of 4 months was too long. And what happened was, this was tied to evaluation in this way, is that the IEP goals ended up being inappropriate because they were made without sufficient evaluative data. So from that meeting in December until they got the evaluation back in April, this court says the IEP goals were not appropriate because they didn't have sufficient evaluative information. And this shows that link then from being able to describe those needs in the present level that are going to be addressed through goals. Without appropriate goals, it made it impossible for this district to provide FAPE. Here's another case, a little different piece, but this was that the district correctly determined that the student didn't qualify for special education under the category of emotional disturbance. And this was that the student's behavior had to affect their educational performance to a marked degree. That was part of the criteria. And in looking at all of those pieces, the district had to determine whether or not, it had affected grades, behavior, peer relationship. Here, the student demonstrated behavior characteristics of a student with an emotional disability, but they maintained A's and B's. So we've got one piece, right? Grades. They had friends, so they had some social connection. So that's another piece, social, and was liked by the teachers, so had relationships with adults, another, piece that wouldn't have necessarily led to them thinking that it was adversely affecting the student's performance. So you can see that the major takeaway is you can't rely on a single piece of information when you're determining and conducting that evaluation. Use the evaluation wheel. Look, make a plan where you use more than one individual to ask and answer and probe and inquire around, do you have any suspicions in these areas? And do you have data that would allow you to answer that question? So we started with the comprehensive evaluation.
Stephanie, we do have a question. We do have a question when you're ready.
Okay.
The question is, should parents be involved in writing the goals of the IEP? Juanita asked this question and she said, I talked to parents who have not been involved in writing the goals. The school writes the goals after the eligibility meeting without the parents?
So absolutely, I mean, goal writing is part of the IEP process. And the IEP process is conducted by a team, including the parents. There is nothing that would prohibit a district or teachers or staff from providing some draft goals or explaining goals as they're connected to the student's needs. And parent can have input. You need to be able to demonstrate, maybe the parent asks questions about it. Maybe the parent is okay with, says, yeah, I can see how that connects to the present levels and the goals. So, I mean, yes, it's prohibited that parents would not participate in a process where goals were written because that's part of the IEP process. But there isn't any prohibition against the development of goals by school staff and having a conversation about them. And they may or may not change.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Does that answer the question? Yeah, let me know if there's follow-up to that.
Okay.
So again, just in looking at how these things connect and trying to draw your attention to the importance of that comprehensive evaluation, because what we're looking at on the screen right now is the components of FAPE. You can see where comprehensive evaluation sits. It's really at the very beginning. And without that information, the likelihood or the missing piece creates broken links along this continuum. The next piece that we're going to dive into is this idea of the link between special education and general education. It's a critical link, but sometimes not well understood. So since this Act, the IDA, and previously the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, special education has been defined as specially designed instruction. So special education, specially designed instruction. A little bit of a myth. Special education is a place where instruction occurs. Not so. Remember, go back to that definition. Special education means specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the needs of the child with a disability. And this could include instruction that is conducted in a classroom. If the student is homebound in a home, they may be in a hospital or an institution or any other setting, but it's instruction. And it could also be instruction in physical education. Specially designed instruction means adapting as appropriate to the needs of the eligible child under this part, the content, methodology, or delivery. Let's think about adapting. If we look at just the definition of adapting, it's that you make something suitable for a new use. So think about that. We're making the instruction suitable for a new use based on the student's needs. That other things about adapting, adjusting, reshaping, reorganizing, customizing, refining. The piece here is that you're not changing the target. You're not modifying the target. You're just customizing the instruction so that it addresses the unique needs that result from the child's disability, and it allows them to access the general education curriculum so that they can meet the same standards as that apply to all children. So the purpose is to connect and allow them to access the general curriculum. And keep in mind that the general curriculum, it's the same curriculum as for all non-disabled children. So let's, just to kind of make sure that we're all understanding this the same way. There's a Dear Colleague letter And it was written from OSERS back in 2015, I believe November of 2015. And it says, without a doubt, the department interprets the curriculum as the same curriculum as for non-disabled children to be the curriculum that is based on the state's academic content standards for the grade in which they're enrolled. So it's the same, that the target is the same. We expect annual IEP goals to be aligned with state academic content standard for the grade in which the child is enrolled. So that sometimes is like, well, if they were able to perform at grade level, then, you know, why would they be a student with a disability? But it's clear that it's grade level content. It may be restricted in scope or complexity. It might be that they're working on, you know, spiraling down of prerequisite skills, introductory skills, but the target is the same. It's grade level content. And we can't lose track of that piece. Now, I understand that there, for a very small percentage of students who might be on a different path as far as alternate assessments, there may be, you know, some downward extension of those standards in order for them to be able to access their curriculum. But in the situation, in that situation, we need to keep in mind that it still needs to be that their annual goals need to be sufficiently ambitious in that way. Thinking about that it's something that they're going to do over a 1-year period of time. So they can't be goals or discrete skills that the student is going to master in a very short period of time, keeping in mind that they need to be ambitious but achievable. And it looks something like this if you connect the two. So access to the general curriculum, that's for all students. For some students who are eligible with an IDA disability and need special education, those special education services, they support the student in the general education curriculum. And for some students, they need related services in order for them to benefit from their special education. So they wrap around one another in that way. The link between general education and special education, it's linked together through the IEP. Think back to where we started with the present levels. We've linked the student's needs to the present levels, and now we're linking that to goals in order for them to make progress in the general curriculum, to reach the standards, the same standards through IEP goals as all other students. IEPs need to be implemented across all environments throughout the school day and throughout the school year. Implementation failures, so the failure to implement the IEP, the failure to provide services, usually happens when individuals, not teams, are making decisions. Teachers don't decide in their classroom when services and supports are given. Teams make those decisions, and teachers are responsible in their environment to implement those supports and services. Keeping in mind that, you know, multiple minds, and that general education teacher and that special education teacher and the PE teacher and the music teacher, the student across environments, the power of multiple people making decisions of what they observe the student's needs to be is much more powerful than a single individual making decisions about a student. So just how much discretion does a principal, teacher, paraprofessional, or a bus driver have? They don't have discretion to, you know, veer from the IEP. The IEP is, think about the IEP as a pseudo contract. that has been developed by the team, and it is required in order for the student to receive FAPE. And FAPE is their right under the procedural safeguards. Let's talk a little bit about who can deliver special education. Special education could be delivered by general education teachers. It could be delivered by special education teachers. They provide specially designed instruction. And I think that the big piece to not allow yourself to get into this kind of thought is think the type of instruction, not who. And what might that look like? There are lots of different models. So there are consultative models. It might be that a student with disabilities receives their instruction, accommodations, modifications from a general education teacher in a regular class. Special education provides support by consulting with the general education teacher, planning the service delivery, monitoring the student's IEP progress, and planning or readjusting when it's warranted. They may be supporting the student in the classroom. There are also lots of co-teaching models where a general education teacher and a special education are both physically present and contributing to the instruction in the classroom. But keep in mind that general education teachers can also provide specially designed instruction through this type of model. And a highly qualified special education teacher, they must be involved in the planning and implementation, monitoring of the special education services. We have some OSIP guidance that recognizes that classrooms across the country, that they're changing and that they're innovating and they're increasing the flexibility of the methods of teaching, and we wouldn't want to not take advantage of those pieces. So there are lots of different ways that the needs of learners can be met through those other situations and methods. So what's your model? Who provides special education in your schools? And just the pitfall here is not to think that there's only one way to do it. I mean, when you think about the delivery of instruction, wouldn't you want the person who's the expert in whatever content to be the one delivering the instruction to the student? So think about that piece of it as well. And I'll just leave you with this case out of Colorado. It's a Jefferson County case. And this is just summarized. In summary, this was not a school setting. It was actually a residential setting, and there was arguments about whether or not the residential setting met the requirements of school. But this little piece about what kind of puzzling through, it's not the who, it's actually the what it is. And this court really said it in a very direct way. In summary, special education is defined by the type of service provided, not the licensure of the person providing it. As long as there is a piece of it, it can't just be anybody. As long as it was a state accredited education program with adequately licensed teachers. So as I said, this was a residential facility. So it had to be an accredited education program, and the teachers had to be licensed. But again, the focus is on the type of service provided, not the licensure of the person providing it. Here's another scenario about that kind of overlap or connection between special education and general education. What if your school provides differentiated instruction for all students? So every student is getting some sort of differentiated instruction. Is an IEP still needed? The answer would be yes. The LEA must provide a child with a disability specially designed instruction. It addresses their unique needs, ensures access to the general curriculum, even if this other instruction is being provided to other children with or without disabilities in the same grade, in the same classroom, in the same building. Think about this. The IEP addresses all of the students' needs. So it's this bundle of services, sticks within this bundle. And so when you're looking at it, you're saying, in order to address this student's needs, what are all the resources that we have as a school or as a district? And then you build a program specific to this student, individualized for this student with all of those resources. So it is a fact that some services may be a best practice and part of the district's regular education program, and it wouldn't preclude those services from meeting the definition of special education because it's connected to the child's IEP. It's connected to their unique needs and the services that they need as part of FAPE, as part of their bundle or sticks of service. The final piece is just remember that once determined by the team, services have to be provided in accordance with the IEP. And that a general education teacher is an important part of that IEP team. It's that another link, that connection between general education and special education. Are we good, Susan? Any questions?
Only on how to unmute myself. No, no questions. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about accommodations. Here's another connection to general education curriculum, right? It's connecting those experts of the content in the through the general education teacher and determining what this student needs in order to be able to access the general education curriculum. And those are determined by the IEP team. All the more important for a regular education teacher to be at the table when this plan is developed. It's a process for making decisions. Making decisions about accommodation should be a process. And what the IEP team is really trying to do is trying to level the playing field for the students' participation in the general education curriculum. So they're trying to figure out how the student can access instruction, where that documentation might be found. It could be in special factors when you're talking about communication or assistive technology. It might be under supplementary aids and services, where you're talking about what are those supports or services that the student needs in order to be in a regular classroom to really access that general education curriculum. It also could be specifically in, how is the student going to participate in assessments? But understand that checking boxes or, looking at a checklist of accommodations can be a pitfall. You have to use caution, and you have to make sure that the decision is based on this student's need for participation, to offer them the equal opportunity to participate in either the assessment or instruction. So kind of thinking about categorizing accommodations, if you think about it in ways of one way to think about it is presentation accommodations, response accommodations, setting accommodations, and timing and scheduling accommodations. So this, these are all, this is from the IRIS Center, but it just shows you like what are some of those barriers related to the way information is presented, and how would a presentation accommodation allow the student to access that information. Either it could be visually, it could be through auditory means, and here are some examples. It could be large print, it could be audiobooks, it could be closed captions on videos. So just all of these things in order to support the student being able to access the instruction, to access the general education curriculum. And there are lots of different pieces out there, lots of different accommodation guides. Wyoming has an accommodation guide for assessment. So use those pieces to think about specifically for this student, after you've identified that this student has a barrier related to the ways information is presented or the way they respond to information or the environment in which they are in when they're being able to take information in. Any of those things you need to think about. Do they need a supplementary aid and service or an accommodation in order to be able to access that piece? So what's the link? There is a link between accommodations, special education, and assessment. And there are specific conversations. I think that there's we need to think about accommodations generally, and then there are some more specific conversations that happen around assessment. That could be district assessments, it could be statewide assessments, but why does it matter about this piece? It matters because all students with disabilities need to be included in general and statewide assessment programs, and they need appropriate accommodations if necessary. It can't be that they're not able to demonstrate what they know as a result of a barrier to them being able to access the assessment. So think about this though. Generally thinking, there are many instructional accommodations that potentially may not be able to be used for assessment, but it doesn't work the other way around. You shouldn't have an assessment accommodation that isn't part of the student's instructional accommodations. So it doesn't work in the reverse. The student should be utilizing the accommodation in an instructional environment if it's necessary for them in an assessment environment. However, there could be instructional accommodations that might not be allowed on certain assessments. So again, IEP teams need to have these conversations about the differences between accommodations, both in the instructional setting and the assessment setting. And it needs to be that those accommodations are tied directly to a student need, not just kind of checking the boxes on those pieces. You need to be able to articulate why this student needs that accommodation in order to be able to demonstrate what they know. Because really, isn't that what the testing is about? We want to know what the student knows versus what they can access. So keeping that in mind when you're thinking about assessment accommodations. More generally, in an assessment accommodation, it's allowing the student to participate in the assessment, doesn't alter or lessen the learning expectations. So, the demonstration of a particular level of achievement, it doesn't change that piece of it. It simply just allows them to access that accommodation. So this one comes from the North Carolina Department of Instruction. Another way to look at it, this one comes from the Kansas Accommodation Manual, and this is just that there can be potential pitfalls with not knowing, being familiar with the assessments and what is the appropriate use of accommodations for particular assessments. It's the job, that's the job of the educators sitting around the table, is to inform the IEP team of those potential pitfalls of where an accommodation might not be allowed as part of an assessment, and then preparing the student for that so that they're not surprised and overwhelmed by the fact that there are particular instructional accommodations that might not be available on an assessment. So you want to prevent these things. You want to break down barriers by identifying what are those supports, accommodations that can be provided to a student in order to get beyond those barriers. it's to provide access, and it's really that you want to be able to test to measure what the student knows, not what they can access. So the last piece that we're going to talk about before we open it up for some questions or dialogue or other thoughts is this idea of monitoring progress. And we can't really talk about progress or the story of progress unless we ground that in what that standard is. So the Andrew F. case was the FAPE case that was most recently decided, and it was decided in 2017. And it gave us some really, great language about how much progress, because this was a case of a student who, from the school's perspective, they had measured, they had documentation that they had provided progress notes. They had goals that they had, measured progress in their minds on those things. But it really comes down to this, how much progress is necessary in order to be able to say that it's FAPE for a particular student. And we have the Rowley case from 1982 that is still a good description of what FAPE is for most students. What Andrew F. did was provide some additional clarity around that FAPE standard, and it added on some additional clarity for those students who may not be achieving at the same level. They may be making incremental progress. So how do you determine what that, whether or not progress is enough? So every child needs to have the opportunity to meet challenging objectives. In the fact that you can't get to an offer of an educational program that provides nothing more than a de minimis amount of progress. So it can't be. You can't provide just de minimis. It's the same as almost providing no educational at all. So it has to be more than that. So that's how we know it has to be more than that. But how much more than that does it have to be? It requires an educational program reasonably calculated to make progress appropriate. And this was the addition. This is the important part, in light of the child's circumstances. So you start to see that it's, again, FAPE is an individualized standard, and it's going to be based upon an individualized determination and unique to every child. Education program has to be appropriately ambitious in light of his or her circumstances, just as advancing from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. So our standard for students in a regular classroom is that they're advancing from grade to grade. And in the same way, the educational program or the IEP has to be appropriately ambitious in light of this student's circumstances. The IEP has to be designed. So here's the pitfall: is think back to those links, the evaluation, the present level, the measurable goals, the services in the LRE. All of those pieces have to be linked together in order to enable the child to make progress. That's the essential function of the IEP, and the degree of progress contemplated by the IEP has to be appropriate for this student based on their unique circumstances. This piece becomes super, super interesting based on the importance of data and the importance of documenting progress. So it's not just a number. It's not just a percentage. It's being able to describe why that progress, why, a certain amount of progress is appropriate for this student in light of this child's circumstances. So I say that because thinking back to the Andrew F. case, they had progress. They had a measurable goal. They had documented progress. But what they failed to do was tell that story about why was it appropriate in light of this child's, Andrew's, circumstance. So data in a vacuum is not helpful to FAPE. Educational benefit, that progress, needs to have a description of why is this progress for this student. This data tells this story. So being able to describe that. This is just a demonstration of that connection to the unique circumstances of the student and how it has to be connected. This is the case of a student who had a severe learning disability in reading and made not as much progress as the child's parents would like for him to make. He wasn't making up a grade level every year. And the court acknowledged, it said that the reading progress of a fifth grader achieved under his IEP was maddeningly slow. It nonetheless concluded that the IEP was specifically tailored to the student's severe learning disability. And it found, because of that, that the child received FAPE. So a district has to ensure that the IEP of a student is reasonably calculated to provide FAPE. So it has to be based on that student's unique needs in order to provide FAPE. You have to link those components. In this case, the parents alleged that the IEP failed to address their child's severe reading deficits. They claimed that over the course of several years, the student achieved little progress in reading. However, the court found that the reading program outlined in the IEP was individualized. That connection had been developed and identified through a comprehensive evaluation, and the services and the goals were specific to this student. They weren't generic or broad goals. They were specific to this student, and therefore it was specific to this student and met his needs. And the court said that the reading program, that the student knew skills and techniques, he could demonstrate those. So he had generalized those and he was applying them in the regular classroom. And although the parents argued that the student was still reading at a second grade level, the court said that didn't render the student's IEP inappropriate. So you can see that, had this district just reported that maddeningly slow progress, that the student had made, like maybe had made some gains, but not a lot. Had they not explained it in the context of linking those things together based on the student's needs, and that the student was able to demonstrate those newly gained skills in the regular classroom, that's what made it unique, and that's what made the progress reasonable in light of the student's circumstances. So the message really has to be that it needs to be ambitious in light of the child's unique circumstances. And how will IEP teams know? How will they know if the student has made progress or it's appropriately ambitious? It goes back to the FAPE continuum. And if you get to the end of that FAPE continuum, start to look at, was the student comprehensively evaluated? Were those needs identified in the present level? And did the IEP team design those measurable annual goals to provide services in the LRE? And then was the documentation of growth and progress, was it described? Was it data and an explanation to document the growth or progress? And if there's no progress, if you can't connect those pieces, then you have to go back and find the broken link. Are there new evaluative questions that need to be answered? Does the present level need to be refined because there are some new current needs, or there have been changes in the student is advanced to another grade and there have been changes in the expectations. Do those need to be reflected and planned for in the present level? Refining or revising goals, adjusting services. Does the student need more support? Does the student need some additional related service? And then scrutinize the environment. Is it the right one? Is the student able to access the information, the general curriculum in the way they need to? Or does it demonstrate that the student may need a more restrictive environment? Because there is no guarantee. I said treat the IEP like a contract. That's the guarantee that students have an IEP, but there isn't a guarantee of a particular amount of progress. That's not what the IEP guarantees. It guarantees FAPE, that you'll use the process, you'll use the IEP process if there is a lack of progress. And how do you do that? I would suggest that you do that using the 4 R's, which is you reconvene, you review, you re-strategize, and you revise the IEP to take another attempt at trying to provide, that rigorous plan for that student to make progress in light of their circumstances. So in closing, we walked through child find and some of the pitfalls, delaying, not recognizing the triggers, not having a system of child find and responding to parents' requests for an evaluation. In evaluation, we just really focused on don't do the serial evaluations, really use the evaluation wheel to conduct comprehensive evaluations and determine eligibility based on the students meeting the criteria as well as what is their educational needs, the importance of linking special education to general education, and the need for those two things to work together. They're not parallel. They actually build on one another. Special education supports general education. It also, that discussion about it's not the who that provides special education, it's the what instruction is provided, and that connection to a general education teacher. And then around accommodations, just ensuring that there's a discussion about both instructional accommodations as well as assessment accommodations, and knowing whether or not assessment accommodations are allowable, and having that discussion and avoiding the danger of just using a checklist and not individualizing those accommodations based on the student's needs. And then finally, ensuring that there is a way to monitor progress in light of the student's circumstances so that you can determine whether or not FAPE has been provided. And if the student is not making progress, that you reconvene that IEP team in order to make adjustments to reach FAPE.
Stephanie, I really thank you for that. Something that really has hit home with me, and I've been pondering, is really the documentation of progress and the challenges that IEP teams face in documenting that progress, like in context, and then also, like what you said, is explaining how a skill might be generalized. Because what we see oftentimes is a 2 or 3 sentence narrative on the goal page that says making progress towards the goal or whatever, and it's done every 9 weeks or every trimester. But it sounds like really being detailed in the progress, documenting progress is what's really going to be able to demonstrate, if a school district needs to, that they have been working towards the right thing, and the goals are appropriate and the services are appropriate. It all comes down to that, those progress notes, really.
Yeah, really good observation, Susan. I think that if nothing else, Andrew F. was also a progress monitoring case, not just a FAPE case, but it was a progress monitoring case, because this district could demonstrate that they had monitored progress, at the appropriate times. Parents had received that progress. So it's not just, it's not just the compliance side of it, being able to say, yep, we wrote a measurable goal, we use this tool to monitor progress, but it's really describing why that progress is, ambitious or rigorous enough for this student based on their unique needs. And really it starts to get at that kind of, every student is unique. The potential of every student to make progress is unique based on their educational needs. And you need to be able to describe that progress in those terms.
Right.
Because if not, someone just, the stranger looking at that information, their reaction is like, they could do this one time at the beginning of the year, and a whole year later they could do it twice. Well, there might be a lot of, that might be appropriate, or that might be important to know. They could do it one time on 10 tries, and now they can do it twice in every environment, no matter how many tries that, like, that's a lot of progress. So I just think that you have to be descriptive about the progress, because it's unique to the student, and it's also going to make or break FAPE.
Right. So if, I was thinking, like, if progress is documented well and explained well, then you can sort of go backwards and say the accommodations were appropriate, the specialized instructions were appropriate, the goals were appropriate, because, you're documenting that through progress. We could go on, but I really want to thank you so much for being with us today.